Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight to this presentation about cost of production. We've been a coffee company for almost 20 years now. Next year, we're going to be 20 years. And we started as a coffee importer in the UK, in London, in the year 2000, and trying to source high-quality coffees from Colombia initially. I'm originally from Colombia. I was living in London at the time. And we wanted to do something very different from what everybody else was doing. And at the time, quality was not something that people were talking about in coffee. And we just decided that that was kind of a really good niche, a really good thing to do. But we wanted to import coffee. We didn't want to export coffee. And very soon enough, we found out that if we weren't sourcing our own coffees in Colombia, we wouldn't be able to do it. So in 2002, we started our export company. And the rest is kind of history, but in 2010 we decided to go back to importing. We set up Caravela Coffee in North America with the help of Body. And today we now have operations in 7 Latin American countries, which are part of the study that we're going to see tonight. And we also have importing companies apart from North America, we have companies in Australia, the UK, and we just recently opened an import office in Taiwan for the Asian market. So it's a company that has grown a lot in the last few decades. We now have more than 200 employees. And one of the things that we've been very proud of is our sustainability efforts in the coffee world in Latin America, making sure that the coffee producers that we are sourcing from are improving every year, not only in the quality and in productivity, but also their quality of life. And kind of that's what's inspired us to do this cost of production study that we'll show today. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight, the what and the why, kind of a primer on cost of production. Then we're going to explain the methodology that we're using. This is a very new methodology, so there's something that a methodology has never been used before in terms of cost of production studies. Then we'll go into the details and what are the numbers, what does it really cost to produce coffee in these 7 countries in Latin America. Then we'll look at the farmer profits, and finally some final thoughts about the subject. Good, so let's begin. So the what and the why. What is cost of production and why we're doing this? So the definition of cost of production is basically the cost incurred by any coffee farmer from the moment that they plant the seeds to the moment they deliver coffee at the farm gate level, which is basically when they deliver coffee to any particular buyer of parchment in these 7 countries in Latin America. And one thing that's important, in these 7 countries, most of them, the trade of parchment coffee is in dry parchment. So it's a raw product before it's milled and exported. Except for Nicaragua, which is a country that we've been working for in the last 7 years, and that's where the only exception to the rule is that country where farmers actually deliver wet parchment to one of our drying facilities in the country. But the good thing is that you can always translate one basis to another, and so these costs, the cost that we'll see tonight, are all in green bean equivalent, so it's in green coffee equivalent, even though the parchment costs for a farmer are actually to the parchment level, we can always translate that into green coffee equivalent. And so it's very important to understand the numbers we're going to see tonight do not include any profit for the farmer. It's basically a break-even price for the farmer. No money made by the farmer, but with the numbers that we're going to look tonight. Why it is important and why are we doing this? So as I said before, we've always been a company that's been trying our best to make sure that the farmers that work with us are sustainable, that are making money and actually can grow and prosper. And so over the course of the years, we've seen that a lot of farmers don't really keep track of their costs. So probably the only thing that they keep track of is how much they pay to their pickers, because of course they have to pay their pickers, so they need to know how many kilos of cherries that every picker has picked, and that's basically the only thing that they keep track of. They don't have any accounting records. Most of them don't even know what accounting is, and so it's hard for them to really calculate the cost of production at the farms. So the last few years, as you've known, coffee prices have been very low, and we've been getting a lot of farmers complaining about prices and complaining about the situation. And so when we ask them, how much does it cost to produce coffee, they don't have a clue. So the first thing that we said, well, we need to educate ourselves and we need to educate the farmers on what the costs are. So that's what motivated us to do this study. And not only educate the coffee producers out there, we also found out that most coffee buyers, if not all coffee buyers, don't even know what it costs to produce coffee in the world. So everybody prices coffee basically based on the C market or what others are pricing coffee at, or whatever the exporter or the importer is charging. But nobody really knows what costs to produce coffee. So to that in mind, we really said, well, let's really figure it out. And of course, we started doing it the normal way, and then we found out that it was very difficult. We're not going to get very far with that. So that's why we developed the methodology. The second most important thing is create that awareness. And this is mostly related to consumers. Consumers often complain about prices, right? They say, well, coffee is too expensive. $4.50 cappuccino, that's really expensive. Or a $3 filter coffee, that's very expensive. But they don't really know how much it costs to produce coffee, and they don't even realize that in reality, I think $3 or $4.50 a cup is actually very cheap for a cup of coffee, especially something that has so many hands touching it and that is very craft and artisan. So it's very important with these studies, it's very important that you guys go out there and really create more awareness among consumers and amongst other coffee professionals. And the third one is perhaps the most important in our point of view, is to be able to really price the coffee that we're buying from these farmers in a sustainable way. So are we paying a good price to the farmers? Are we not paying a good price to the farmers? Should we pay more? So that's something that this study has really allowed us to determine is a sustainable price for each one of the farmers that we buy, and also answer the questions that many of the companies that we work with are asking us. For example, why is an Ecuador coffee more expensive than a Colombian coffee? That's a question that we often get asked, and that's something that this study has really allowed us to answer the question in a very methodic way. So what influences cost of production? And basically what you see here is some of the influencing factors. The first one is efficiency of supply chains. As you might know, there's the farms in most of these countries in Latin America are very far away from the main towns and from the ports. So the farther you are, the less efficient your supply chain is, and therefore the bigger the costs. That's a big factor that influences costs, and you're going to see a lot of those things popping up as we see the numbers. The second one is inflation. And you may not know, but in Latin America, it's very common for prices to be increased every single year. By what? By inflation. So why is this? Generally in Latin America, minimum wages are set by the government every single year. So if, for example, in 2019, the inflation in, let's say, Peru is 4%, the government sits down with the unions and with the industry folks, and they kind of come up with a number that they want to increase minimum wage, usually a little bit above inflation generally. And so, because labor is such an important thing, every single good and services are actually increased every year by inflation. And this causes more inflation, but that's what it's a custom. And so, of course, if you're paying for electricity, one year it costs 100, but the next year it's going to cost 104, and so on. So it creates higher costs for everybody in the economy. And the third one is exchange rates. So most of these countries, with the exception of El Salvador and Ecuador, have their own currencies. That is not the US dollar. El Salvador and Ecuador adopted the US dollar about 15, 17 years ago. But the rest of the countries have their own currencies. And of course, those currencies, the power or the exchange rate between those currencies, those local currencies, and the US dollar change over the course of the years because of macroeconomic factors. So if you have Imagine having cost in Colombian pesos, 100 pesos for something, but the exchange rate was 1 to 1, so it would cost you $1 that year. But then the next year, the exchange rate is now not 1 to 1, but 1 to 2. So how much would it cost in dollar terms the next year? Half the amount. So this is something that happens, and that's something that really affects the competitiveness of one country against the other. And that is very important, and we'll look at this study. We'll see what has happened in the last 2 years, because we started doing this in 2017, and so we'll see it in 2019, and we'll see the effect of exchange rate movements in those 2 years, so you can actually see the power of exchange rates and how that affects the competitiveness of one country versus the other. Fourth one is regulation, taxes, tariffs. And that's something that is out of the control. So the four initial ones, the efficiency of supply chains, inflation, exchange rates, and regulation, that's something out of the control of the farmer. Farmers cannot control that. They just have to basically take what it is. But the fifth one is, and perhaps a very important one, is productivity, the yields of their farms. As some of you know, there's a lot of fixed costs in running a business, and coffee is no different from any other business, that it has a few fixed costs. So you want to divide those fixed costs by as much units, as much production as you can to reduce your overall costs. And that's something that most farmers, or any farmer in the world, can really control. There are other four. They're out of the control of the farmers. So that's something that we really have to pay attention, and that's something that at Caravela we try to explain to farmers, that if there's one thing that they need to manage, is their productivity. The other one, quality. Those are the two factors that coffee farmers can control, and that's something that they have to really focus on, because the rest, it's out of their control for the most part. We have fixed costs, and you also have variable costs, depending on the cost structure. One is more important than the other, but coffee has a few fixed costs. The main being administration costs, the cost of managing or administering the farm. That's a fixed cost. Those are costs that you have whether you want or not. You always have to pay them. Another one is equipment costs. You have to buy a pulper. You have to set up your tanks. You have to have a drying patio. That's a fixed cost. Whether you use it or not, you have to pay it. It's a cost. But the important thing, as I mentioned before, with fixed costs, if you can make those equipment more efficient, i.e. you can crank more product from the same equipment, then your costs are reduced, your unit costs are reduced. And the third one, a very important one in coffee and in any agriculture product, is inputs. And by this we mean mostly fertilizer. So the model that we'll see is assuming that these are conventional farms, they're not organic farms, and they're actually buying inputs to maximize their productivity. And then there are a few variable costs, the main ones being, for example, harvesting. The picking depends on how much you pick. If you pick more cherries, you have to pay more. If you pick less cherries, you have to pay less. And then the other one is labor cost, mostly related to pruning, weed control, the application of the fertilizer, and so on. Those are also variable. And then finally, transportation costs is another one of the main variable costs, because if you have more fertilizers to bring to your farm, you have to pay more. If you have less, you pay less. And the same happens with your coffee that you have to bring to market. So very important to understand this primers on coffee, on cost of production. So moving on, let's look at the methodology that we at Caravela developed to make sure that we could get to a number that we would feel comfortable with and that would be as accurate as possible. So given the fact that I was telling you before that farmers don't have accurate records of any of their costs, right, or their inputs, and that most studies that we were looking at, that we were reading, actually don't include all costs, or actually have a very small sample base. Remember, we're talking about countries like Colombia with 500,000 farmers, or Mexico with 400,000 farmers, or Peru with 130,000 farmers. So this is a huge number of farmers, and most studies are including a very small part of those farmers. If you look at most studies, you read them, there's studies that have at the most 600 farmers being surveyed. And usually in a very particular part of that country, not the whole country, because it would be very expensive to do interviews to 2,000-3,000 coffee farmers all around one of these countries. They're big countries, with the exception of Ecuador and probably El Salvador. These are relatively big countries where it would be very expensive to do these studies. And the third factor is, in reality, every farm is unique. There's no farm that is similar to the next one. Not even two farms next to each other are similar. So you have these three factors that make it very complicated to actually get an accurate cost of production number that you can say, this reflects the cost of Colombia or Ecuador or Peru or whatever country in Latin America. So given that, and the fact that before I was in coffee, I actually was an investment banker. I worked in New York and London valuing companies, doing M&A work, so basically mergers and acquisitions. I would do, the main part of my day-to-day was actually working with Excel spreadsheets and doing developing financial models to actually properly value these companies. So why not use that knowledge, that expertise that I had to actually develop our own financial model to model coffee farms. It's the same thing, it's a business. The costs are actually a P&L, a profit and loss account. So, hey, why not do the same thing that I would do, but this time for coffee farms? And these used to be huge companies, billions of dollars that I would work on. This is much simpler than huge companies. So with that in mind, we developed our own cost of production model, the Caravela COP, or cost of production model. And what's the basis for this model? The first thing is to be able to really compare one country with another and one farm with another, well, would be very difficult. So what we want to do is we created a standardized farm size and a standardized farm management or technology for all the countries. It's the same size, the same technology, the same productivity, and the same inputs. So everything is the same. The only difference would be the market cost of each country. Given that each country has its own currency, it has its own efficiency, its own regulation, taxes, well, very simple. We create a spreadsheet where we have all your efficiencies, all your productivity, all the farm size equal, and then we input the market cost into the model to get to the final cost. So this makes it very easy to compare one country to another, and we eliminate a lot of the barriers or all the problems that we had with those surveys and those studies that have been previously done. It's not the reflection of every single farm in that country. It's the reflection of what we would call a benchmark or model farm in each country, which is quite important because some farms are very inefficient. Should we be paying inefficient farms? Should we be paying and subsidizing those inefficient farms? Not really. The world doesn't work like that. Everybody has to work to be very efficient. So we're assuming a highly efficient coffee farm in each one of these countries. So in reality, what we're getting to is a benchmark cost of production for each one of these 7 countries. What are the assumptions? It's very important. So the farm size is about 3 hectares. That's the average, and that's very similar to the average farm size that Caravela works with. And it's also the same size of the farm, an experimental farm that we own in Colombia and that we operate in Colombia that produces very good coffee. So that is a good basis for us to really learn what are the costs, what are the inputs that you need. And it has helped us really develop this model because, of course, that farm, we do have a P&L of the farm. So we do have that as a basis for the development of the model. In terms of productivity, we're talking about 30 to 35 bags per hectare. Most farms in Latin America don't have that productivity. But remember, we're not talking your average farm, we're talking the benchmark farm. The one that is the model farm that we're gonna try to achieve that productivity of 30 to 35 bags per hectare. And you may be asking yourself, is it achievable? Is it realistic? Yes, we do have a great number of farmers, not only in Colombia, but in other countries that are achieving 30 to 35 bags per hectare. In fact, our farm Belgravia in Colombia is achieving about 40 to 45 bags per hectare of productivity. So it is possible, it is achievable. It's not easy, but if you have the right technology and you're committed and you're really working on a farm, that is a number that is relatively easy to get to. It's about half or a little bit less than half of what a Brazilian coffee farm today can achieve. Today there are farms in Brazil that are getting 70 to 80 bags per hectare. And the average in Brazil is about 35 to 40 bags per hectare today. So it is achievable. Of course, different countries, different technologies, and of course different scales, because farms in Brazil don't tend to be, or it's very hard to find 3 hectare farms in Brazil. But in the other countries that we work with, that 3 hectares is feasible. We're also assuming renovated area to be about 15%. So, and this is not really area, this is trees. So if a farmer has 5,000 trees, he would be renovating about 650 trees per year of the total of the 6,000 that he has. And why is this important? Because if farmers don't renovate about 15 to 20% of their total trees every year, production rises very fast when they plant the trees, and they get probably to 7th or 8th year to a peak level, but after that, productivity starts to go down. As the tree ages, productivity goes down, and they might find a place or a time where 15 years after they planted, they're producing very little coffee from the same tree. It could produce, actually, if you look at the peak year, most farms during the peak year, if they haven't done any pruning or any renovation, there are farms that we've known that in the peak year, 6 or 7 year, can produce 50 or 60 bags per hectare. But on average, because of renovation, we're maintaining a very flat 30 to 30 bags per hectare in the model. The other important assumption, and this, usually a 3 hectare farm in any of these countries would not hire a farm manager, a CEO for the farm. No, that doesn't exist in these small farms. So who is doing the management? The family. The husband or the wife of the family is doing the management, and actually spending a lot of time either helping out with the picking or managing the pickers, or washing coffee, fermenting coffee, pulping coffee, drying coffee. That's part of the job that they are doing as well. And so, to be fair, we wanted to include any family labor costs in there. And what we've done in the model is we've assumed that it's 1 monthly minimum wage for each farm. So the monthly minimum wage in Colombia and Mexico and so on. And finally, we're using market prices for the rest, for all the input costs and harvesting costs and things like that. We are including market prices. So these are the 7 countries where we did the study. We've done the study 2017 and 2019. Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Those are the 7 countries where we have our own sourcing operations. And we do them in these countries because we are sure and confident that because we have our own team on the ground, we can actually get good information about those market prices. We're not relying on one particular farmer to give us the market prices. We're relying on the prices that we can actually find out ourselves in those markets. What costs are included? So, of course, labor cost, inputs, the depreciation of any of their equipment, admin costs, family labor, transportation, taxes, renovation, right? So everything is in there except for 3 costs that we don't feel confident about projecting, which are the cost of the land. Land would vary greatly from even in a small municipality or county. The cost of land varies widely, and usually depends on how far it is from town, what's the roads, the same thing that would happen in any major city, right? So we don't feel very confident of really putting a value or the cost to the land, and also because most of these farmers have really inherited the land, so it hasn't cost them anything because it's been inherited. So it would be difficult to project, and the reality is that for most farmers it didn't cost them anything. And the other one is financing costs. Also very difficult to project, and the reality is that most 3 hectare farmers in Latin America don't even get financing. at least not formal bank financing. And if they do get financing, well, it varies as well greatly. We've heard farmers paying 3% a month of interest, usually to coyotes or somebody rich in the town that charges a lot of money for something that is very scarce for those farmers, which is financing or money. And also, it's very difficult to say, well, what's the indebtedness of a farmer? Is it 30%? Is it 40%? Is it 100%? Are they have to get money for how much money do they need of financing? And the third one that we don't include is environmental costs. That's also that's probably the one that's harder to really factor into the model. But apart from that, I think we have 90 to 95% of the cost that a coffee farm would incur in Latin America. So with that introduction to cost of production, let's dig into the data. And the first thing that is very important to look is minimum wage. Of course, given that there's a minimum wage in each one of these countries, and it's a legal minimum wage, you would think that every single labor cost, would be extremely tied to that minimum wage. Especially, as I was mentioning, countries where that is like, mantra, minimum wage, that's what it has to be. We decided to add into this graph 2 additional countries, Costa Rica and Brazil, just to compare for comparison purposes. 2 other important coffee origins, Brazil being the largest coffee origin in the world. And you can see how Brazil is relatively very competitive in terms of minimum wage compared, especially like, for example, to Ecuador, around here. Ecuador minimum wage is $386 a month. That's a dollarized economy. An economy that, because it's rather small and the government is the biggest employer, it has very low unemployment, something like 3.5% unemployment, even lower than the US, which US is around 4% unemployment. Guatemala is also a lot more expensive than most other coffee origins. Most people don't really know that Guatemala is a rather expensive in terms of labor country. But then you see some outliers in the lower part of the range, Nicaragua being the cheapest in terms of minimum wage, followed by Mexico. And then you find Costa Rica at the opposite end, almost twice as much as Colombia or Brazil. So as you can see, minimum wage varies widely amongst these 7 different countries that we're looking at. The other thing that is very important to look at is, as I was mentioning before, currency. So this graph, what we did here is we're graphing the exchange rate of the Peruvian sol, the white line. The Colombian peso is the red line, the Brazilian real is the yellow line, the Guatemalan quetzal is the blue, and then you find the Mexican peso in the green one. And as you can see in this graph, it's not the actual exchange rate, it's a base of 1. We put a base of 1 at the beginning of 2017. So in that day, they're all equal to 1, and then we're tracking what happens with the currency war, what happened with those currencies over the course of 2.5 years, from 2017 to October 2019. And we did this study in 2017, we did in June, and we repeated it again in June 2019. So you can see here, if one of these graphs is above 1, that means that there's depreciation. That particular currency has lost power against the dollar during that period. And here you can see how the Brazilian real has greatly depreciated in those 2.5 years. Some people might ask themselves, why is this? There's multiple factors, one of them being a lot of political uncertainty was the main driver for this happening. The other one being the price of oil. Brazil is a big oil exporter, and of course as oil prices decreased, they've lost currency getting into the country. So 26%, that's a lot of power lost. What that means is that Brazilian costs most likely have gone down by almost, maybe not 26%, but they have gone down by a significant amount because their costs are still in reals, but they're making money in dollars. So that shows you that they're being more competitive. They're becoming more competitive, and that's one of the reasons why the C market, the commodity price of coffee has gone down or went down during those 2 years, because they became more competitive. So they could actually sell at a lower price without losing money or losing less money. The other country that has that we can see that has depreciation has been Colombia, 16%, and that's mostly tied to an economy that's not growing as fast as it did, and also related to oil prices as well. 16% is a lot, and that also is helping Colombian coffee farmers become more competitive in a low market. Well, you can see that the rest of the countries, Brazil, Guatemala, Peru, and Mexico, have had a relatively more stable currency. Some countries like Mexico have actually appreciated in that period. But the rest, for example, it's striking to see how the quetzal and the Peruvian sol are very, very stable currencies. So let's start to see more detail about the proper cost of growing coffee. And these graphs that you'll see in the next few slides show you the 2017 figures and the 2017 in orange, 2019 in blue. So these are the harvesting costs in dollars per kilo of cherry harvested. Usually what farmers do is that they pay the pickers per kilo. The more kilos a picker is picking, then of course more money they get. So that motivates them to be very efficient and really try to pick as much as possible. So you can see here how harvesting costs have stayed relatively flat during the 2 years that we have calculated them. The only exception being Ecuador, where you see a big hike in harvesting costs in these 2 years. And the rest, pretty stable, and surprisingly, very similar. Minimum wages. So why do you think Ecuador has had that really big increase? Very simple. Lack of labor. Ecuador, as I said before, is a country with very low unemployment. And the two main growing regions, one of them is north of Quito, the capital. So it's very hard to find good labor. And what has happened is that farmers are reporting that they're having a very hard time finding labor, and therefore have had to increase the price that they pay per kilo in Ecuador to attract people to pick coffee. As the rest, you can see very similar costs. One thing that really strikes me is, for example, is Guatemala, which is the second highest minimum wage. And yet, as you can see, virtually the same cost per kilo that Colombia, which has about $100 less of minimum wage per month. What you see here is the complete opposite. A good availability of harvest of labor in Guatemala is what shows you here, is that why the cost, despite minimum wage being higher, significantly higher in Guatemala, it's very similar in terms of cost of Colombia. And as if you know, in Guatemala, what happens is that most of the pickers are from indigenous communities that have to migrate during the harvest season, because they don't produce any food during the dry season, and they have to go and find sources of income, which generally is picking coffee in the farms, the coffee farms. You can see how Nicaragua, which is one very low labor cost, actually has a lower cost. Mexico also has a lower labor cost. That's very consistent with that. But Guatemala, despite a higher minimum wage, has a very similar cost than Colombia. So very interesting, the market dynamics of labor markets in how they work in these countries. The other very important cost that you have in coffee farms is fertilizer cost. The recommended dose, of course, depends on soil analysis, but if there's a rule of thumb of how much grams per tree to apply in fertilizer, is somewhere around 200 grams per hectare, per tree. So we're talking about farms that are doing having about 15,000 trees in those 3 hectares. So if you multiply that by 200 grams, that's a lot of fertilizer they have to buy. But yes, it costs money, but it pays back. And one of the things that is very important to mention here is that there's many brands of fertilizer out there and many different formulas. So depending on the formula, if you use more nitrogen or more potassium or more phosphorus, the prices change. So to be very consistent, we're assuming here that it's the same brand. It's a brand called Yara. That's a Norwegian fertilizer company. It actually has, if not the best, one of the best fertilizers out there in the market. And it's available in all the 7 countries. There's Yara being sold in the 7 countries. So we're actually using the same brand and the same formula in the 7 countries to keep that apples to apples hypothesis or methodology that we're trying to apply. And here, now, you do see something very strange. Different than the harvesting cost, the cost of fertilizer has increased. And you can see how they were very similar. So Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia, very similar, and the increase was very similar. Ecuador was very similar as well. And again, big increase compared to the rest in Ecuador. And then Nicaragua is a little bit higher than the rest in 2017. And so is Peru. And then it shot up significantly more, higher than the rest of the countries. The main reason why there's, across the board, it's increased, yes. And the main reason why it increased is the price of oil. The price of oil has actually gone up in the last 2 years, and therefore, because chemical fertilizer is a derivative of oil, then prices tend to go up with the price of oil. But in these countries, you do see a very significant increase. And in the case of Nicaragua, it's quite interesting because what explains this significant increase in Nicaragua is political unrest. So as you've heard, around April of 2018, there was a huge political unrest that has lasted ever since. That political unrest was sparked by changes in the regulation in Nicaragua of health contributions and pension contributions, but also a government strapped with cash. It's got a government that has very little access to funding and therefore has to increase their incomes. And one of the things that they did is that they put VAT on and tariffs on fertilizers, which didn't have that before. So that's why you see that big increase in Nicaragua in terms of cost. Imagine if your main cost, green coffee went up by 60% from 1 year to the other. Pretty tough, huh? That's something that's happening in Nicaragua. To make matters even worse in Nicaragua, because of the political unrest, credit has dried up for farmers. And if you want to find credit in the bank, it's very little that they lend to you, but also interest rate went up from 7% to 18%. So, with that introduction, let's look at the total cost per country. And now these are the costs in 2019. This would be the amount of money in dollar terms that a farmer in each one of these countries would have to spend to produce those 90 bags per year of coffee. We're talking that Ecuador, a farmer would need $23,000 in their pocket to actually produce 90 bags of coffee. Cheapest being Mexico with only $13,000, followed by Nicaragua, and then El Salvador, Colombia. But in general, you can see that a few of those countries are around the $15,000 to $16,000 per farm a year. Now, let's look at that in dollars per pound, so it's easier to digest. So we're talking that a farmer in Mexico, which is the cheapest country, it would cost a farmer, without no profit, just break even, $1.07 per pound. And you see the red line, around the 90 cents? That's what the average price of the commodity grade coffee was during most of 2019 and 2018. And that's an FOB price. The C market price is an FOB, so it includes additional costs. What this graph is showing is basically that in all these 7 countries, farmers selling coffee at the commodity price would be losing money. And not little money, a lot of money. Right? A farmer in Peru would be losing easily more than 50 cents. One in Ecuador would be losing more than $1 per pound of coffee, selling at the commodity price. And you might be saying, well, the solution is selling in specialty. But how many farmers sell their coffee at the specialty market? And if they do sell, what percentage of their coffee, their overall total production, is actually sold at the specialty? We have farmers, fortunately, that have 90 to 100% of their coffee sold at really good prices. But if you ask the majority and you look at the majority of the farmers, we're talking about somewhere between 30 and 40% of their total production is sold at specialty prices. So unfortunately, the solution to this was not necessarily sell to the specialty market. Let's look at the next graph, this one. We separate the cost in terms of cash costs. So the cash cost is what they have to get out of their pocket. Of course, the rest is unpaid labor, the family labor that we're including in the model. But that doesn't necessarily mean that their costs are just that, because they also have to send their kids to school, they have to buy food, so they do have extra costs. But if we were to look at it, in a very strict sense, this is showing you that still, without including the unpaid labor, most countries would not have the money to actually buy and pay for the cost that they have to incur to produce coffee. So, very critical situation for these farmers in Latin America. So let's look at now what has happened in the last 2 years. Have there been any changes, any significant changes in those costs of production? And again, 2017 figures in orange, 2019 figures in blue, and then the yellow line is showing you the change from over the course of 2 years. And here you can see how Nicaragua and Peru, their costs have increased by more than 11% in the course of 2 years. But the rest of the countries, like Ecuador and Colombia, 7%. The only exceptions to this are El Salvador and Guatemala. El Salvador, the main reason why there's a reduction is because the government in 2018 changed a little bit the minimum wage laws and introduced a minimum wage, a differential minimum wage for the countryside, for the rural areas. So of course, as we're assuming minimum wage, that is helping offset a little bit of the cost. Is that realistic? Probably not. We're just trying to keep it consistent from year to year. And Guatemala, mostly due to some changes in their exchange rate that in that June period that we're comparing against each other. Mexico, there's no difference, and that's not because there was no difference, it's because in 2017 we didn't have our own operation in Mexico, so we didn't calculate the number in 2017. But most likely, there has been an increase as well in Mexico in the last 2 years, because as you can see, it's across the board in Latin America. Those costs of production have increased. Now, let's look at the cost structure. That's something that's really important, is to see, are there any opportunities for improvement? And you can see that by looking at the cost structure. So you can see here, administration, which is most of that is family labor, harvesting and other labor. All three are labor related, are people related. If you add those three, for most countries, we're talking about 60% of the cost are labor costs, labor related costs. Why is this critical? Why is this really difficult? Basically because labor costs are something that you can't control. If you're a farmer, if you're a small business owner, you can't say, I'm going to pay less to my workers. No way. What happens if you pay less? They leave. They go find another better, more lucrative job. So we're talking that in some cases, almost 80% of those costs are labor related. 80% of your costs are labor related. 80% of a cost that you cannot control in any way. And to make matters worse, labor costs are always rising. And in these countries, they're rising every single year by inflation. So this paints a very complicated picture for coffee farmers in Latin America. 50, 60, and 80% of your costs are labor related. And those are only going up. They're not going down. And to make matters worse, there is a scarcity of labor. As you've seen in the case of Ecuador, they're having a hard time finding pickers. And this is not going to change. This is probably going to be even more critical. And if you look at what's been on the news regarding Central America with the migration, the caravans, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua are all facing big migrations because of insecurity, of lack of opportunities. So the fact is that labor shortage is we're just starting to see labor shortages, which will most likely mean that cost of production, being 80% of your cost, are continuing to increase in the next few years. Probably the only country that is right now in a good shape for that is Colombia. And why is that? As you've probably also seen in the news, there's hundreds and thousands and millions of Venezuelans fleeing Venezuela because of the political and economic situation. And most of them are coming to Colombia. So if you ask most farmers in Colombia these days, what percentage of their pickers are Venezuelan? Some people are saying about 90% of the pickers are Venezuelans. So that's helping Colombia receive labor that is looking for a job, actually desperately looking for a job, that will most likely help Colombian coffee prices or cost to actually not increase or actually decrease in the next few years. And that's something that we're going to pay a lot of attention at Caravela in the next few years, what the effect of Venezuelan migration is doing to the productivity and the competitiveness of Colombia. One really interesting part also that you see in this graph is renovation. Remember, we're assuming 15% of the trees are renovated, but you can see that you don't even see it have a weight in the cost. Yet the cost is very little, but the actual benefit of it is huge. And that's something that we're really paying attention, and we're trying to educate farmers of the marginal cost that it has versus the huge potential of making sure that you are competitive and you're maximizing your productivity. And there's another outlier in this graph. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's the cost of equipment in Nicaragua. That's the highest of all the countries, and that's because of the fact that in Nicaragua, farmers don't dry their own coffee. They actually pay a service. So in the rest of the countries, the cost of drying is just the cost of the equipment, the drying patio, and the family labor. In the case of Nicaragua, they actually have to outsource this. So that increases significantly their cost, and in the case of Nicaragua. Maybe there's an opportunity for farmers to start drying their own coffee in Nicaragua to reduce this cost. Now, kind of to finalize, let's look at the profitability for each of these farmers. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. The market price, or the sale price, is an FOB basis. The C market is an FOB cost. So basically that FOB cost includes dry milling, packaging, logistics, export taxes and where they are, and export margin, among others. So you have to basically factor this in to calculate that profitability using the market price as the basis to calculate that profitability. So to do that, to calculate the farmer profit, we basically have to take the C price. And we're assuming for the sake of this study a C price of 90 cents, which was, as I mentioned before, the average C market price between 2018 and 2019. Then we have to have another complicated fact, is that none of these countries have the same price. Guatemalan coffee tends to be more expensive than Nicaraguan coffee, right? Why is that? Market values Guatemalan coffee highly than Nicaragua, and therefore that is adjusted in the market by what's called a differential. So we have to include the C price, the ongoing differential for each one of these 7 countries, and then to calculate the profit, we have to deduct the FOB costs, the milling, transportation, logistics, etc., minus the cost of production that we already saw. And if we do this calculation, we are basically finally able to calculate the profit for the farmer. So let's look at that. When doing that equation, we find out that Ecuadorian producers are losing $1.24 a pound if they sell the coffee at the commodity market. If you were an Ecuadorian producer, would you be producing coffee? Probably not. That's why there aren't that many, and every day there are less and less producers, coffee farmers in Ecuador. Colombia, as you see, because of the differential and because it's actually a very competitive origin, it's only losing less than 20 cents. And then Mexico, even though it's the lowest cost of production country of all the surveyed, it's actually still losing about 10 cents a pound, followed by Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and then very interesting to see Peru, a country where people tend to think that it's very cheap coffee, actually is doing really bad, 70 cents a pound if you're a Peruvian producer. And that's one of the reasons why we think that during the last year there's been a lot of farms being abandoned in Peru, is because they're really suffering from high cost due to a relatively well-performing economy that is not depreciating its currency, high inefficiencies because of the fact that most of the farms are located very far away from the ports and from the capital. And so it's making it very difficult for farmers in Peru to actually be competitive in the current market price. Of course, granted, the last month we've seen a 30% increase in the sea market price as supply and demand continue to change, and people expect a lower harvest, or some people are talking about lower harvest next year in Brazil because of some drought that they're facing. But still, this is something that has happened. Low prices have happened for the last almost 2 years. Since 2017, prices really hit rock bottom. And if you're small farmers of 3 hectares that don't even have money to buy food, it's a very critical situation. And one of the things that really happens, and you observe in coffee farms this size, is that they stop applying fertilizer. They stop really doing a lot of things that they should be doing. And once the market goes up, well, they're just recovering. They're just trying to get their head up the water, and when they get their head out of the water, prices go back down again. So it's a very difficult cycle for most coffee farmers. So to finalize, some final thoughts. As you've seen, cost of production are increasing in all countries. There's no single country where coffee cost of production are not increasing, and will most likely continue to increase in the future as labor costs continue to rise, at least by inflation in these countries, and due to the lack of labor and continuous and increase in tightening of those labor markets. At current market prices, and we're talking more, I would say even today with 125, the majority of farmers are losing money. Remember, we're also assuming a very high productivity. If the productivities are lower, most likely the cost will be much higher, because those admin costs have a bigger weight in the whole model as well. So we're probably seeing that not even at 125, today's market price, these small farmers are actually making money. Most likely, we're talking about 150, 160 a pound for the market price to be a break-even price or level for most of these small farmers. More worrying towards the future is the supply of washed Arabica from Latin America is at risk. If you're a coffee farmer and you're losing money, and you've been losing money for 2 years, and you're most likely continue to lose money because you're unproductive, you have very low cash, you're not being able to produce the quality and get the prices that are sustainable, they will start to look at other opportunities. And that means that Latin America, which is the supply for 80% of the world's washed Arabica coffee, is definitely at risk. And if you're a coffee roaster, you probably buy easily 60% of your coffee from Latin America or washed Arabicas. So that means that A, or you're going to have no coffee at all, or B, you're going to have to be buying a lot of naturals from Brazil. The only country that it currently is probably competitive enough at the market prices that we are seeing today. Also a very different coffee growing economy and industry in Brazil than in any of these countries. Look at Costa Rica, high costs, our calculation for Costa Rica is not included here because we don't feel confident about the numbers that we have. But with the numbers that we've received, we're talking about Costa Rica 170 farm gate cost. So pretty high. And that's why you're seeing Costa Rican prices go up significantly. But also you're seeing, even though the price of the differential for Costa Rica this harvest was 90 cents for the lowest grades in Costa Rica, production this year went down by 25% in Costa Rica. And has been going down almost every single year since the 1990s when Costa Rica was producing 3 million bags. Now they're talking about 1 million bags being produced in Costa Rica. So most likely washed Arabica is in decline, and we're already seeing it being almost 40% in the 90s. Washed Arabica is now about 30% of the world's production and will most likely continue to decrease. Maybe the only country that will survive and will probably not continue to increase the productivity and their production would be Colombia. It's a country that has, as you've seen, a more competitive industry because of labor markets and exchange rate movements that are making it more competitive, and of course the Venezuelan migration. So to solve this whole problem, prices paid to coffee farmers in Latin America need to increase significantly, and we're talking almost double to make sure that we're making sure that we can guarantee the supply of washed Arabicas in the foreseeable future. So it's a very difficult situation that we're facing, and I mean we are facing because we're all dependent on coffee, and if there's no coffee, none of us really have any work to do here. So unless we all want to buy Brazilian naturals or Vietnamese Robusta.